Right now we're going to look at one of the most fun aspects of FM8, and that is of course the arpeggiator. But first we need a decent sound, so I'm going to find a synth lead. I want it to be polyphonic. I want a dry, unprocessed lead. I'm going to grab this Smirn-off sound. That'll do. So if we go over and click Arpeggiator, there's a couple of different buttons we can use to turn our arp on. Over here on this global panel, we can just press on here. But there's also this ARP button on the top panel here. And of course, you'll remember from the master page, we've got this arpeggiator panel here, and we can turn it on there as well. These tempo and step resolution values correspond with those in the arpeggiator, so if I double click on the tempo and change that to 130, you'll see that on the arpeggiator it's 130. Now, this tempo doesn't just relate to the arpeggiator. Any effects on the effects page which have a sync button to synchronize to the tempo will synchronize to this tempo. But we only have to worry about inputting the tempo manually when we're using FM8 in standalone mode like we are now. If we're using FM8 as a plugin within our DAW, then it'll just automatically synchronize with the tempo of the song. So we've got tempo. We've got step resolution. And we can put it on triplet mode. Or dotted mode, which basically adds 50% to the length of each note. It makes each note in the sequence half as long again. We've got a note length knob here to control the length of the notes in our arpeggiator sequence. We've got a shuffle knob here if we want to syncopate it a bit. If we go down here to the step sequencer, at the moment we've got a sequence of 8 notes, which at this resolution, 1 in 16, is half a bar. We can make that bigger or smaller. We can have as small or as long a sequence as we want, up to 32 notes in length, which at this resolution would be 2 bars. At the moment, every note in our sequence is triggered, but we can change that if we turn some of these off. Over here we've got our expression panel, and this velocity knob here determines how much velocity each note gets. So you can turn that down or up. And this accent knob here determines how much velocity is added to the notes which are accented, and we can choose which notes are or aren't accented in the step sequencer. You can have a lot of differentiation between accented and non-accented, or not much differentiation at all. This split button over here divides the keyboard between arpeggiated and non-arpeggiated. So, for example, we could play an arpeggiated bass line with our left hand and chords with our right hand. This velocity button over here, when it's turned off, means that the non-arpeggiated notes are affected by the velocity at which we play them. And when it's turned on, means that there's no differentiation in velocity. And if we hit this bass button, that basically flips it around so that it's our high notes that are arpeggiated and our low notes which aren't. Here where it says C3, we can click and drag to change the value of this to determine where on the keyboard the split occurs, or we can hit the Learn button and just hit a key to determine that. So, going back to the step sequencer, above accent you've got tie, and this ties certain notes together, but you have to have your portamento controls set up right to do that. So if I hit master, what we want is portamento on, and we want auto mode turned on, I'm going to lower the time a little bit. Now these notes which are tied together will glide between each other. Now at the moment the pitch of each note in our sequence is entirely determined by the notes we hold down on the keyboard. So if I'm just holding down one note, it'll just play that one note, but if I hold down a chord, it'll cycle through the notes in that chord. If I click this down button here, it'll progress downwards rather than upwards in the scale. But we can, if we want to, use the step sequencer to create a melody sequence that we can play just by holding down one key. And we do that with these transpose and octave buttons. The transpose, we can transpose any note either way in as far as 11 semitones. So I'm just kind of doing this randomly. And we can also transpose things up an octave, as many as 1 or 2 octaves. And we can randomize any of these by clicking these little dice buttons. So we can create a totally random sequence. We've got note order down here, which at the moment, as you'll see, is entirely linear. It's going from 1 to 8, but we can randomize that as well. We can reset any of these just by hitting these little X buttons. And we can shift sequences left and right using these buttons. Up here we've got key sync. When that button is pressed, the sequence will restart itself every time you hit a key. We've got one shot mode, which means it will play only once. We've got hold mode, which means that once you've played a note, you can release your finger off that note and the sequence will keep going. And there are loads of template sequences to choose from if you click this button here. And just like the effects template on the effects page, there are blank user pages here that you can save over if you click save. So if I very quickly just create a randomized sequence with these dice buttons, I can double click here where it says user and give it a name. And if I hit the save button, I can scroll down here and save it over one of my user patches. And you can copy settings, so if I hit the copy button, I can just go to another user sequence and paste the settings from my quirky sequence. Now, there's various different play modes. At the moment, it's on wrap, which means that every time it gets to the end of the sequence, it just loops back round. But you've got ping, which is like an ascending, descending thing. Or pong, which is ascending and descending, but it's symmetrical, so it plays the last note twice. You've got rap +1, where it jumps up an octave the second time round. Or you've got rap minus, which is where it jumps down an octave. You've got last, where it repeats the last note of the sequence. Or first, where it repeats the first note of the sequence. And you've got random, where after the sequence has gone one time, it just randomizes it. And you've got pause, where it literally stops after it's played the sequence once. So that's pretty much everything in the arpeggiator covered. Have a play around with it, experiment, enjoy the randomization. It's really good for like funky 303 style sequences. There's just one last thing I want to show you. Because I'm quite into the whole chiptune thing, one of the things I like to do with the arpeggiator is abuse it so that it sounds like an 8-bit chiptune video game lead. So if I make this smaller grid and put the resolution to 1 in 32 and put the tempo up to something ridiculous like about 200, 211, that'll do. Put it on key sync mode and make sure it's on wrap +1. Now it sounds like this. How cool is that? So yeah, that's the arpeggiator. In the next video, we're going to take our first look at expert mode and we're going to discuss what FM synthesis is really about. So I'll see you then. Don't go away.